Clara Meade had never been the kind of woman who asked for much. That was something people said about her, not as a compliment exactly, but as a quiet observation, the kind that gets made about people who have learned to need less than they deserve. She drove a car that was 11 years old and still carried a dent in the rear quarter panel from a parking lot she could not quite remember. She ate lunch at her desk on most days, brown bag, and a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm by 11. She taught 8th grade English at Harlan County Middle School, and she did it the same way she did everything else in her life, with complete attention and without complaint. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had not been renovated since the late 90s. The radiators knocked through the winters. The window in the kitchen faced a brick wall. The elevator worked on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and by appointment on weekends. She had lived there for 9 years, long enough to stop noticing any of it, and short enough that she still planned, in some distant and unexamined part of herself, to eventually live somewhere better. That plan had no timetable. It had no budget either, which was perhaps the more pressing issue. Her checking account maintained a balance that she thought of not as savings, but as margin, enough to absorb a bad month without disaster, enough to cover the car if it needed something serious, enough to feel, on most days, like she was managing rather than drowning. She had learned the difference between those two states very early, and she held the line between them with both hands. What she did not have was anything that other people might call security. No investment account, no property, no inheritance waiting in the wings. Her mother had died when Clara was 12, and what little that might have been left had passed through her father's hands quietly and without ceremony, spent not on excess, but on the ordinary costs of keeping a family running without a second income. By the time Clara was old enough to understand money, there was very little left to understand. Her father, Thomas Meade, had not been a man of wealth. He had been a man of order. That was the distinction Clara had grown up understanding. He kept records of everything. Receipts in a shoebox organized by month. Notes from phone calls in a spiral-bound pad on the kitchen counter. A handwritten ledger for household expenses going back to the year he bought the house. He was not meticulous out of anxiety, but out of respect, a belief that things deserved to be tracked, that life was worth documenting even when it was small. He had worked for the railroad for 31 years as a track inspector, a job that required walking long stretches of line with an eye for the kind of subtle damage that most people would miss. A fractured tie, a spike working loose, a rail that had begun to bow almost imperceptibly under years of weight. He was good at it because his attention was genuine, not performed. He noticed things because he believed they mattered. After he retired, he grew quieter. He filled the house with books he read slowly, 2 or 3 pages at a time, as if he were inspecting them the same way he had once inspected track. He tended a garden in the backyard that produced more tomatoes than he could eat and which he gave away to neighbors who never quite thanked him properly. He sat on the porch on summer evenings with a glass of iced tea and watched the road with the contented attention of a man who had stopped needing much to happen. Clara visited when she could, which was not as often as she would have liked. The drive was 3 hours each way, and the school year left little room for long weekends. But she called every Sunday without fail, and those calls were the kind that did not require much to be meaningful. Her father was not a man who talked to fill silence. When he spoke, it was because he had something to say. When he listened, he did it completely. He died on a Tuesday in February, which felt to Clara like exactly the kind of day he would have chosen. Unremarkable from the outside. No storm, no occasion, nothing to mark it from any other Tuesday in any other February. He simply did not wake up, and by the time a neighbor noticed the curtains had not been opened by mid-morning, he had been gone for several hours. The doctor said it was his heart. He was 78 years old. He had not been sick, not in any way that had announced itself, and for reasons Clara could not fully explain, that made it harder rather than easier. She drove to the house that same evening, arriving after dark. Her brothers were already there. Dennis and Ray Meade were older than Clara by 7 and 9 years respectively, which meant they had grown up in a slightly different version of the family she knew, one that had existed before the financial strain had become permanent, before their mother had died and changed everything. They had left home at 18 and built their lives in a way that had required distance. Dennis ran a contracting business in a city 4 hours north and had done well enough that well enough was no longer the phrase he used. Ray had married into a family with money and had developed, over time, the manner of someone who had always had it. They were not bad men. Clara had never thought of them that way. But they were practical in a way that sometimes moved faster than grief allowed. And they had arrived at their father's house already thinking about the next steps, already measuring the space between sentiment and resolution. The house itself told its own story the moment Clara walked through the door. Her father had lived there for 40 years, and the accumulation of 4 decades pressed gently against every wall. Books on improvised shelving, framed photographs in clusters along the hallway, boxes in the spare room that had not been fully opened since her mother's time. The kitchen still smelled like coffee, which hit Clara somewhere below thought and stopped her in the doorway. For a moment, she could not have explained to anyone. Dennis was at the kitchen table with a notepad. Ray was on the phone near the window. Both looked up when she came in, and there was warmth in it, the real kind, the kind that coexists with everything else without contradiction. "Long drive," Dennis said. "I'm fine," she said, which was not quite an answer and which they all understood. The next 3 days were the kind that cannot be prepared for regardless of how well-organized a person believes themselves to be. There were calls to make and forms to complete and a funeral to arrange with the quiet efficiency that the business of death requires. Clara moved through it in the way she moved through most difficult things, by focusing on the next task rather than the full weight of what the tasks added up to. It was on the second day that the conversation about the house began. Dennis had raised it over dinner, practical and without apology, which was his way. The house was paid off, he said. The market in that area had improved. If they agreed to sell, the proceeds would be split 3 ways according to the will, which was straightforward and had no surprises. Clara said she understood, which she did. Ray added that the house would need to be cleared before any listing, which was also true. 40 years of accumulated life did not simply carry itself out the door. There would be furniture to consider, books, papers, personal effects. Most of it would need to go. Clara said she understood that too. What she did not say, not that evening, was that the idea of it made something tighten in her chest in a way she was not prepared to examine. She ate, she listened, she agreed where agreement was appropriate, and she kept the tightening to herself. The following morning, while her brothers were on separate calls handling separate pieces of the logistics, Clara walked through the house alone. She moved slowly, the way her father had moved through his days, with attention. She looked at the photographs without taking any of them down. She ran her hand along the spines of the books without pulling any of them out. She was not cataloging, not yet. She was simply being there, in the quiet of a house that still felt inhabited even though it no longer was. It was in the last room at the end of the hallway, a room that had served various purposes over the years and had settled in her father's final decade into something between a study and a storage space, that she found it. It sat in the far corner, beneath a brown canvas tarpaulin that had been tucked around it with the same deliberate neatness her father applied to everything. She pulled the canvas back without knowing quite why. Perhaps because neatness covering something always implied that the something mattered enough to protect. The steamer trunk was large, larger than she had remembered it, though she had not seen it since childhood and had not thought of it in years. It was old, genuinely old in the way that objects became when age was not something they had survived but something they were made of. The body was constructed of dark wood that had been finished with something protective that had long since dulled to a matte sheen. Iron straps ran across the top and down each side, their edges worn smooth. The hardware, the latches, the hinges, the corner brackets was blackened with tarnish, but intact, each piece still serving the function it had been made for. Across the top, someone had stenciled a set of letters and numbers in black paint, a shipping designation of some kind, the kind that would have been applied for transit across an ocean or a continent. Most of the stenciling had faded to near illegibility, but a few characters remained clear enough to read. Clara crouched and studied them for a moment, not because she understood their meaning, but because they deserved to be looked at. The trunk was locked. That much was obvious from the latch mechanism on the front, a heavy iron device with a keyhole that had been designed for something more substantial than a standard trunk key. She pressed the latch gently. It did not move. She stood and looked at it for a long time. She had no memory of her father ever opening it, no memory of its contents being mentioned or its presence explained. It had simply been part of the house, the way certain things are part of houses, accepted without interrogation because they have always been there. She went to find Dennis. He was finishing a call in the kitchen, his notepad full of figures she did not look at. When she described the trunk, his expression shifted in the direction she had expected, toward the practical. Old trunk. Dad had a bunch of stuff stored in that room, he said. If it's locked, we probably don't have a key. We can call a salvage company. A lot of that old stuff gets donated or auctioned. She said she thought they should open it first before deciding. He looked at her for a moment. Clara, we've got a whole house to get through. If it's locked and we don't have the key, it's probably empty anyway, or full of old papers. Maybe, she said. Ray came in from the hallway, phone now in his pocket. He heard enough of the conversation to catch its direction. The one in the back room, he said. I saw that. Heavy old thing. Not worth much as furniture, I don't think. That style doesn't move well. I'm not talking about its furniture value, Clara said. Her voice was calm. She had a teacher's voice, the kind that did not need to raise itself to be heard. Ray shrugged in the way that men shrug when they believe they have already made the more reasonable argument. It's probably full of old linens or something. Or nothing at all. Dad wasn't exactly a collector. She did not argue the point. She went back to the room and stood in front of the trunk again and thought about what she knew of her father. He had kept receipts organized by month. He had maintained a ledger for 40 years. He had inspected railroad track with his eyes because he believed that small damage, left unexamined, became large damage. He was not a man who locked things for no reason. That evening, while her brothers were dividing the logistics of the following day between them, Clara went through the house looking for keys. She checked the obvious places first, the kitchen junk drawer, the hook by the door, the small wooden dish on the dresser in her father's bedroom. She found house keys, car keys, a key to a padlock she could not identify, and a small collection of keys for locks that no longer existed. She checked less obvious places, a tin on the bookshelf, a zippered pocket in a bag her father had used for the garden, the back of a drawer in the study desk. She found nothing that matched the trunk's lock. She sat on the edge of the bed in the spare room that night and looked at the canvas tarpaulin she had left pulled back, the trunk visible beneath the weak overhead light. She could hear her brothers in the living room, the low murmur of a conversation she was not part of, their voices carrying the rhythm of people who had already moved past the house and into the question of what came after it. She thought about what Dennis had said. Call a salvage company. She thought about what Ray had implied. Not worth much. She thought about how quickly things became decisions when no one slowed down to ask what they actually were. She made her choice there, quietly and without announcement, the way she made most of her choices. Whatever the trunk contained, she was not willing to let it be carried out with the linens and the spare bedroom furniture. She would keep it, take it back with her if she had to, and find a way to open it that did not involve destroying what her father had thought worth locking. The next morning, before her brothers were fully awake, she went to the room and made sure. She pressed the latch again. She examined the hinges and the corner brackets. She looked at the base where it met the floor and noted the slight compression in the old carpet beneath it, the impression of a weight that had sat in the same place for a very long time. Then she went to the kitchen and made coffee, and when Dennis came in, she told him she wanted to keep the trunk. He poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter and looked at her with the expression of an older brother who has learned which arguments are worth having. Keep it where? He asked. Your apartment? I'll figure it out, she said. Clara, it's massive. You're on the 3rd floor with no elevator. The elevator works some days, she said. It was an old joke between them. He almost smiled. It's probably empty, he said again. Then it costs us nothing to let me have it. He considered that for a moment, then lifted his coffee cup and let the point go. It was not concession exactly, more the recognition that some arguments had already been decided before they started. Ray was less accommodating when he heard. He stood in the doorway of the room, and looked at the trunk with the assessing gaze he brought to anything he was considering the value of. "It's not worth having it hauled," he said. "It'll cost more in transport than it's worth." "I'll handle the transport," she said. "Clara." His voice had the weight of patience being managed. "We're trying to get this done in a reasonable amount of time. If you start taking individual pieces out of the clearance process, it complicates things." "It's one trunk," she said, "and it was Dad's. I like to keep it." He looked at her for a moment, then at the trunk, then back at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a man who had decided the argument was not worth the effort it would cost. "Fine," he said, "but we're not waiting on it." She said they didn't need to. She hired a local man with a truck to help her move the trunk to her car on the last day of the estate clearance. It took 4 people and a furniture dolly and considerably more effort than the transport costs suggested it would be worth. Her brothers watched from the doorway of the house with expressions that communicated, without words, that they believed she was making things harder for herself than necessary. She thanked the men who helped her, paid them, and drove away from the house with the trunk secured in a rented trailer behind her car. The house receded in her rearview mirror, and then the road turned and it was gone. The drive back took 4 hours. She stopped once for gas, and once because the highway stretched flat and featureless, and she needed the movement of walking into a gas station and back out again to feel real. She stood in the parking lot for a moment with the cold air on her face and looked at the trailer and the shape of the trunk beneath the cover she had tied over it. She thought about her father's handwriting in the ledger, the way he dated every entry, the way he noted not just what had been spent, but sometimes why, a small notation in the margin. Furnace repair, necessary. Car service, due at $60K. He believed in knowing what he had and why he had it. He did not keep things carelessly. She got back in the car and kept driving. The trunk sat in her apartment building's storage unit for 3 weeks before she found a way to get it upstairs. In that time, she thought about it every day without quite resolving into action. She looked up trunk restoration and vintage hardware and locksmith services in her city and made notes without making calls. She was good at gathering information before she committed to it, a habit that came from years of designing lesson plans for students who asked more questions than she had time to answer unprepared. The locksmith she finally chose was a man who had a small shop near the community college, recommended by her neighbor who had needed a vintage cabinet opened the previous year. He was older, meticulous in a way that reminded her of her father, and when she described the trunk's lock over the phone, he did not dismiss it or promise certainty. He said he would need to see it in person before he could tell her anything useful. She arranged for him to come to the storage unit rather than move the trunk again. He arrived on a Saturday morning with a case that held a collection of tools she did not have names for, and he spent 20 minutes simply examining the lock before he touched it. He asked her where the trunk was from, and she told him she did not know. He asked how old she thought it was, and she said she genuinely could not guess. He turned the latch mechanism carefully and made a sound low in his throat that communicated interest without excitement. "This isn't a standard trunk lock," he said. "This is closer to what you'd see on shipping crates. Commercial freight. Pre-1950, I guess, maybe earlier." Clara stood with her hands in her coat pockets and said nothing. He worked for another 20 minutes with several different tools, his movements precise and unhurried. When the lock finally yielded, it did so with a sound that was less a click than a release, a letting go of something that had been held for a very long time. He stepped back and looked at her. "You'd like to open it?" She nodded. She lifted the lid herself. It was heavy, the iron straps adding resistance beyond the wood alone. It opened in 2 stages, tilting upward until the hinges caught and held it in place, revealing the interior all at once. The smell that came out was not what she had expected. She had anticipated dust, rot, the closed-air scent of something long sealed. Instead, the air that met her was dry and faintly sharp, carrying something she would later describe to herself as old paper and something metallic, like the inside of a very old safe. The trunk had been lined in a deep green fabric, heavily textured, that had held its color with a fidelity that surprised her. The lining was not decorative, she understood immediately. It had been chosen for protection, dense and close-woven, the kind of material that buffered against moisture and movement. The interior was divided by a horizontal shelf running across the full width, a false bottom designed as storage above and below. The upper section, immediately visible, held objects that were wrapped individually in cloth, each one tied, rather than taped, the knots precise and consistent. Beneath the wrapping, shapes suggested themselves without revealing what they were. The locksmith stood a respectful distance away, and she was grateful for that. She reached in and lifted one of the wrapped objects. It was heavier than it looked, dense in the way that concentrated things are dense. She turned it in her hands before unwrapping it, trying to read its shape through the cloth. Rectangular, flat but not thin, firm. She undid the knot carefully, the way her father tied everything, with a method that could be untied and retied, nothing destroyed that did not need to be. The cloth fell away. In her hand, encased in a clear protective sleeve that had been sealed. At the edges was a sheet of paper the color of old honey. The paper was covered in small printed images, each one defined by a perforated border, arranged in careful rows. She tilted it toward the light from the storage unit's overhead fixture and looked at what she was holding. She did not know enough to name what she was seeing, not precisely, not with the vocabulary that would have placed it accurately. But she knew, in the way that anyone knows when they're holding something that was never meant to be ordinary, that these were not the kind of stamps one peeled from a booklet to mail a letter. She set it down carefully on the cloth it had come from and looked back into the trunk. There were other objects wrapped in the same way. Many of them. She could not count them without disturbing the arrangement, but the upper section alone held more than she could cover with both hands spread. She reached toward another wrapped piece, then stopped. The locksmith cleared his throat quietly from behind her. "I'll leave you to it," he said. He quoted his fee. She thanked him, and he left without another word. She did not move until she heard the storage unit's outer door close. Then she stood there alone in the cold of the storage facility, the trunk open in front of her, the light overhead casting everything in its particular shade of institutional yellow, and felt the first real stirring of something she had not allowed herself to feel since she drove away from her father's house. She did not know what was in the trunk. Not exactly, not in any way she could verify or quantify, but she knew that her father had locked it. She knew that he had covered it with care and left it undisturbed for longer than she could account for. She knew that the lock the locksmith had spent 20 minutes opening was not the lock of a man who stored old linens carelessly. She reached in once more and, very carefully, lifted the protective sleeve with the sheet of small printed images and held it up to the light again. The colors in the images were faded but present, their detail fine in the way that things made to last were fine. Along one edge of the sheet, in the smallest possible printing, were characters she could not read, and a numerical designation she did not understand. But what she did understand, what needed no expertise to feel, was the quality. Not monetary value, not yet. Simply the unmistakable weight of something that had been preserved because it was worth preserving. She set it down again, rewrapped it with the same knot she had undone, and placed it back where it had been. She closed the trunk lid. She stood in the storage unit for a long time, not moving, not planning, simply absorbing what had just happened. Then she took out her phone and, for the first time in the 3 weeks since she had driven the trunk back from her father's house, began to look for someone who would know what it meant. Her brothers had told her to burn the trunk. Not literally, perhaps, but close enough. Not worth hauling. Probably empty. It complicates things. She had heard those words and kept the trunk anyway. Not out of stubbornness. Not entirely. But out of the same quality her father had possessed and passed to her without ceremony. The belief that things deserved to be looked at before they were discarded. That small damage, left unexamined, became large damage. She did not know yet what was inside. She did not know if the objects in the upper section were worth anything in the way that changed lives or merely in the way that satisfied curiosity. She did not know what the false bottom of the trunk held, what lay beneath the horizontal shelf she had not yet lifted. She knew only that her father had locked it, that someone before him had shipped it across enough distance to warrant a stenciled designation on its lid, and that the world was full of things that looked worthless from the outside until someone slowed down long enough to look. She drove home through the city in the early afternoon light, the storage unit locked behind her, and she thought about her father walking the railroad track alone in all weathers, his eyes moving along the steel with an attention most people would have called unnecessary. Looking for what was wrong not because disaster was inevitable, but because it was preventable, because the small things were where the truth lived before it became obvious. She had kept the trunk. Now she needed to understand what she had kept. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark of her apartment and listened to the radiator knock through its familiar rhythm and thought about the feel of the object in her hands. The weight of it. The protective sleeve sealed at the edges. The green lining inside the trunk that had held its color across decades of being closed in the dark. By morning, she had made a list. It was the kind of list her father would have made, organized and specific, written in a notebook rather than on a phone screen, because notebooks did not run out of battery and did not require her to squint. At the top of the list was a single question, the only one that mattered before any other question could be answered. What is it? Below that, names. A museum curator she had read about in a local article the previous year. A university with a philatelic studies program 3 hours south. An auction house whose website, when she had looked at it the night before, used words she found herself reading twice and then a third time. She did not know yet what the trunk contained in any measurable sense. She knew only that her father had believed it was worth locking. And she had learned, in 47 years of watching him attend to small things with large care, that his judgment in such matters was rarely wrong. She poured her coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of her and began to make the calls. The first call she made was not answered. The second rang through to a voicemail she left a message on, careful with her words, vague enough to avoid sounding either ignorant or alarmed. She said she had come into possession of some vintage printed materials through a family estate and was looking for someone who could help her understand what she had. She left her name and number and hung up. The third call connected. The man who answered taught in the humanities division of a state university 2 counties over. He had written articles on philatelic history that Clara had found during the previous night's research, and his name appeared often enough in the sources she trusted to suggest he was credible without being unreachable. He had a voice that was unhurried and precise, the voice of someone accustomed to questions asked by people who did not yet know what they were asking. She described what she had seen with the same economy she used when writing lesson plans. Sheets of small printed images, protective sleeves sealed, perforated borders, a color she described as honey, faded but intact. The numerical designation. She had not understood. There was a pause on the other end that lasted long enough to register. "Can you read me the designation again?" he asked. She read it from the notes she had made the night before, slowly, each character clear. Another pause, shorter this time, but different in quality. "Where are you located?" he said. She told him. "I have a seminar Wednesday morning," he said. "I could be there Wednesday afternoon, if that works for you." She had not expected that. She had expected a referral, perhaps a list of resources, certainly not an offer to drive to her location within 2 days. She said Wednesday would work and gave him the address of the storage unit. After she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand and thought about the quality of that pause. A man who taught and wrote for a living, a man who dealt in information daily, did not go quiet at a description unless the description had given him something to go quiet about. She turned that over in her mind without drawing conclusions from it. She had learned long ago that the gap between a promising sign and a confirmed fact was the most treacherous distance a person could cross too quickly. She went to work on Monday and Tuesday and did her job with the steadiness she had always brought to it. She taught her students about narrative voice and why it mattered, about the difference between a story told from the outside and one told from within. She graded papers on her lunch break. She stayed late to meet with a student who was struggling with a book report and needed someone to sit with her while she worked through what the book had actually been saying. On neither day did she mention the trunk to anyone. It was not a decision she had to make consciously. She simply understood that what she did not yet know could not be shared responsibly, and that speaking about it before she had something real to say would only complicate whatever came next. Wednesday afternoon arrived with the particular clarity of a cold day with no cloud cover, the kind of light that made everything look more defined than usual. She was at the storage unit 20 minutes early. She unlocked the door, switched on the overhead light, and stood in front of the trunk the way she had stood in front of it the first time, without rushing herself into movement. The man arrived punctually. He was older than she had imagined, somewhere in his mid-60s, with the kind of build that suggested a lifetime of desk work offset by deliberate walks. He carried a bag over one shoulder and wore glasses that he pushed up his nose when he entered the storage unit and saw the trunk. He did not speak immediately. He walked toward it the way the locksmith had approached the lock, with the contained focus of someone who has learned that first impressions are worth protecting from interference. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the lid. She nodded, and he lifted it with both hands, carefully, then stood looking at the interior without touching anything. "The lining is original," he said. It was not directed at her. It was the kind of statement a person makes when they are thinking aloud without meaning to. He reached into his bag and removed a pair of white cotton gloves, which he pulled on with practiced efficiency. Then he reached into the trunk and, with a care that she recognized as instinctive rather than performed, lifted one of the wrapped objects. He undid the knot the same way she had, slowly preserving it. When the cloth fell away and he held the sealed sleeve up to the light, the quality of his silence changed. It was not the pause of someone processing information. It was the stillness of someone who has confirmed something they were not entirely certain they expected to confirm. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he lowered it and turned to Clara with an expression she could not fully read, because it was the expression of a man working very hard to hold several things in balance simultaneously. "How much do you know about philately?" he asked. "Very little," she said. "My father kept the trunk locked. He never discussed it." "And you don't know where he got it?" "No. I know he worked for the railroad for 30 years. I know he was a careful man. Beyond that, I can't tell you the trunk's history." He nodded slowly, as if the answer itself was information. He looked again at the sleeve in his gloved hands, tilted it once more toward the light, and then set it down on the cloth with a precision that told her it was not going back into the trunk anytime soon. "I need to look at all of them," he said, "if you'll allow it." She said she would. What followed was the most concentrated 2 hours Clara had spent in a long time. He worked methodically through the upper section of the trunk, unwrapping each object and examining it in the same sequence. He used a small loop from his bag for some of them, holding it to his eye and leaning close in the way that jewelers worked over stones. He made notes in a small pad. Occasionally, he photographed an item with his phone, handling the device as an afterthought compared to his attention to the objects themselves. Clara stood and watched and said nothing. She had not been asked to participate, and she understood intuitively that her role in this moment was to be present without intruding. She had sat with enough students working through problems to know that the best thing she could do was hold the space still while someone else moved through it. When he reached the horizontal shelf, he paused and looked up at her. "There's a second compartment below this," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't opened it." He looked at her for a moment, and she thought she saw something in his expression that might have been respect, though it could equally have been calculation. "May I lift it?" "Please," she said. He found the edge of the shelf with his fingertips and lifted it carefully. It came up cleanly, hinged at one end, a single panel of wood lined on its underside with the same green fabric as the rest of the interior. Beneath it, the lower compartment of the trunk came into view. Clara leaned forward slightly. The lower section held objects of a different kind, not wrapped in cloth this time, but stored in what appeared to be folders of heavy archival card, each one closed with a ribbon tie rather than a knot. Several of them. She could not count them precisely, but the compartment was not empty. Far from it. He lifted one of the folders and opened it with the same deliberate care he had brought to everything else. Inside were more sealed sleeves, these ones larger, and the images within them were different from the sheets in the upper compartment. Individual pieces rather than full sheets. Larger, more complex, some of them in colors that even the protective sleeve could not fully contain. He looked at the first one for a very long time. Then he set it down and looked at the next. Then the next. He did not speak for several minutes. When he set the last folder down and straightened, he removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose for a moment. It was a gesture of a man organizing his thoughts before he risked speaking them aloud. "I need to be clear with you about something," he said. "I'm a historian. I can tell you what I'm looking at in historical terms. I cannot give you a monetary valuation. That requires specialists who do this professionally, who have access to auction records and market data and authentication technology that I don't carry in a bag." "I understand," Clara said. "What can you tell me?" He put his glasses back on. "What's in the upper compartment," he said, "are sheet examples of issues that were printed in very small quantities. In some cases, quantities that have been debated in the literature for decades because confirmed surviving examples are so rare. Several of these," he gestured toward the arranged sleeves, "I have only seen in photographs. I have never stood in the same room with one." Clara was quiet. "The lower compartment," he continued, "contains individual pieces of a kind that appear in major auction catalogs perhaps once or twice in a generation. I recognize several of them from descriptions and images I've studied over 30 years. One of them," he paused, and in the pause was something she could only describe as gravity, "I believed until approximately 45 minutes ago to exist in only 2 confirmed examples worldwide. You appear to have a third." The storage unit was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a truck moved through the lot with a sound that came and went. Clara looked at the objects arranged on the cloth on top of the closed lid. She looked at the open lower compartment with its archival folders. She thought about her father walking the railroad track in all weathers, his eyes moving along the steel, looking for what was wrong, looking for what was there. "What does that mean?" she said. "In practical terms." He looked at her carefully. "It means you need people who are better equipped than I am to answer that question. But I want you to understand something before you contact anyone else." He paused again, and the pause carried a weight she felt the edges of before he continued. "What is in this trunk is not something you should discuss with anyone you do not have specific reason to trust. Not because of any wrongdoing on your part, but because objects of this kind attract attention of a particular kind, and attention, once started, is very difficult to redirect." She thought of her brothers. She thought of the drive home with the trunk in the trailer, of Dennis's face in the doorway of their father's house. "I understand," she said again. He gave her 3 names before he left. A senior conservator at a major auction house, a specialist in a city 4 hours away who authenticated rare philatelic items for insurance purposes, and the name of a lawyer who handled estate and cultural property matters. He said the lawyer first, before the others. He made that point specifically. She thanked him, and he left with the same unhurried manner he had arrived with, though she noticed, as he walked to his car, that he paused once and looked back at the storage unit before he got in. She locked the unit, drove home, and sat at her kitchen table with the notebook open and added 3 names below the list she had already made. Then she wrote 1 word beneath them and underlined it twice. Lawyer. The attorney's name was Margaret O'Say, and she operated out of a small firm that specialized, as the professor had described it, in estate and cultural property matters. Clara found additional information about her before making the call. The same way she prepared for parent-teacher conferences, thoroughly and without assuming the meeting would be easier than it might be. What she found confirmed the referral. Margaret O'Say had handled cases involving discovered estate assets, disputed inheritances, and what one article described as the complex intersection of personal property law and cultural heritage designation. Clara called on a Thursday morning from her classroom during her preparation period. Margaret O'Say picked up her own phone. That was the first thing Clara registered. Not a receptionist, not a voicemail. The woman herself, direct and attentive from the first word. Clara explained the situation without embellishment. Her father's estate, the trunk, her brother's decision to disregard it, her choice to keep it, the professor's visit and what he had said. She did not mention specific items or the word he had used to describe them. She described only the structure of the situation, the facts arranged in the order they had occurred. Margaret O'Say listened without interruption. When Clara finished, there was a brief silence that felt professional rather than uncertain. "You said your brothers agreed to let you take the trunk as part of the estate settlement?" "Informally," Clara said. It wasn't in writing. Is the estate still open? Has it been formally closed through probate? Clara said it had not. The will had been filed, but the process was still ongoing. The house had not yet been sold. That matters, Margaret said. In the absence of a written agreement, the trunk's status as your personal property versus part of the estate could be contested. It's unlikely to be complex, given what you described, but unlikely is not the same as impossible. She used the word contested without drama, the same way a doctor used the word biopsy. It was a word that required acknowledgement rather than alarm. They arranged to meet the following week. Margaret asked her to bring whatever documentation she had regarding the estate, the will, and any written communication with her brothers about the trunk specifically. Clara said she had very little of that last category. Margaret said that was expected and that they would work with what they had. After she hung up, Clara sat at her desk and looked at the classroom around her. 28 chairs arranged in rows. A board she had written 3 essay prompts on in the morning. Posters on the walls that she had chosen with care because she believed the things students looked at all day had an effect on what they thought about. A stack of graded papers she needed to return. She had taught in this room for 6 years. The salary it provided was enough to live on with discipline and not quite enough to do anything beyond living. She had spent 6 years being exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was doing, without complaint and without expectation of dramatic change. She thought about the professor's silence when she had read him the designation from the trunk lid. She thought about the word he had not used, but which had pressed against every sentence he spoke in that storage unit. She returned the graded papers at the end of the day and drove to the storage unit after school. She did not open the trunk. She simply sat in her car in the parking lot of the storage facility for a while, watching the door of the unit the way her father had watched the road from his porch on summer evenings, with the attention of someone who had stopped needing much to happen and had found, in that stillness, a kind of clarity. Whatever was in the trunk had been there for a very long time. It had survived her father's life and his death and 3 weeks in this storage unit in the professor's gloved hands. It would survive another week. She drove home. The meeting with Margaret O'Say took place on a Tuesday afternoon in an office that was modest and precisely ordered, which Clara found reassuring. A person who controlled their environment the way Margaret controlled hers was a person who controlled their thinking the same way. The books on the shelves were organized, not decoratively, but functionally. The files on her desk were labeled. Nothing about the space suggested performance. They talked for 90 minutes. Clara laid out the estate situation in full, including the history of the trunk, her brother's positions, and the professor's assessment. Margaret listened and took notes and asked questions that were specific and without assumption, the kind of questions that existed to gather information rather than to guide the conversation toward a predetermined conclusion. At the end of it, Margaret folded her hands on the desk and spoke with the same directness she had shown on the phone. My recommendation, she said, is that we formally document the trunk as an item you remove from the estate with the verbal agreement of your co-heirs before the estate is closed. We notify your brothers of its existence and your claim to it in writing, not because you are legally required to disclose the contents at this stage, but because it protects you. If the trunk's value becomes apparent later, which it may, you want documentation showing that your possession of it was transparent and agreed upon, not concealed. Clara considered that. What happens when I notify them? That depends on them, Margaret said. Some people, when told that a family item has been kept by one heir, respond with disinterest. Others respond differently, particularly if they believe value is attached. They told me to burn it, Clara said. We're close enough. That is useful context, Margaret said, in a tone that suggested she had heard that particular kind of context before and knew exactly what it was worth. Document it if you can. Any message, any email, any written reference to their position on the trunk before the value became apparent. Clara thought of the drive home from her father's house, the trunk in the trailer, her brothers in the doorway. She had not thought to document any of it at the time. There had been no reason to. It had been a trunk, a locked box, probably empty, probably old linens. I don't have much in writing, she said. We'll work with what you have, Margaret said again. She began the authentication process the following week, contacting the specialist the professor had named. The first was a conservator at a major auction house who agreed to an initial consultation via video call before any items were physically moved. Clara set up her laptop on the workbench in the storage unit, opened the trunk, and held each item carefully to the camera for the conservator to see. What happened during that call was something Clara would later struggle to describe accurately, not because she lacked words, but because the words available to her seemed inadequate to the thing they were meant to contain. The conservator, a composed woman with the kind of expertise that expressed itself in precision rather than enthusiasm, became progressively more still as Clara moved through the items. Not frozen, not shocked, but the way a person becomes still when they are working very hard to remain composed. At the end of the upper compartment, the conservator asked to see the lower section. Clara lifted the shelf. She held each archival folder open to the camera, turning it slowly. The conservator said nothing for nearly a full minute. Then she asked, very quietly, whether Clara had opened any of the sealed sleeves. Clara said she had not. The conservator said that was exactly right. She said she would need to make some calls. She asked whether Clara was in a position to bring selected items to the house's secure facility for physical examination under control conditions. She said secure several times, and each time she said it, the word carried a different weight. She also said something else before the call ended, in the measured tone of someone choosing language with great care. I want to make sure you understand that what I'm seeing, even through a camera, even without direct examination, is not something I encounter regularly. In 22 years, I have seen items of this category individually perhaps a handful of times. What you're showing me is not individual items. She paused. I don't want to say more than that until we've done proper authentication, but I want you to have appropriate context. After the call ended, Clara sat on the folding chair she had brought to the storage unit for such occasions and looked at the open trunk and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would have been equal to the moment. Her father had walked the railroad track in all weathers. He had kept a ledger for 40 years. He had locked a trunk, covered it with canvas, and left it in the corner of a room without a word of explanation. She thought about what the professor had said. Objects of this kind attract attention. She thought about what Margaret had said. Others respond differently when they believe value is attached. She thought about her brothers in the doorway of their father's house, patient and practical and already thinking about what came next. She closed the trunk carefully, secured the lock with the temporary mechanism the locksmith had left in place, and sat for a while longer in the quiet of the storage unit before she stood and left. That evening, she called Dennis. Not to tell him everything, not yet, but because Margaret had been clear about the value of transparency in its proper sequence, and because she was her father's daughter and her father had not been a man who avoided difficult conversations. He had simply been a man who prepared for them first. Dennis answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the slight, preoccupied quality of someone who had been in the middle of something. "The trunk," she said. "Dad's. The one I took from the house." A pause. "What about it?" "I had it looked at." "I'm having it looked at," she corrected. "I wanted you to know." Another pause, this one with a different texture. "Looked at by who?" "Specialists," she said. "I'm not ready to tell you more than that yet. I wanted you to know I'm being careful." The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. She could hear him thinking, the way siblings can hear siblings thinking across distances and years. "Clara," he said slowly. "What's in it?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Not completely. That's what I'm finding out." She heard him exhale, a sound that was not quite impatience and not quite concern, something in between, the sound of a man recalibrating. "You should have told us before you took it." "You told me it was probably empty," she said. Not with heat, simply with the calm of a fact being restated. "You told me it wasn't worth hauling." The silence after that was the kind that did not require filling. She let it sit, the way a teacher lets a question sit when the student needs time to arrive at the answer on their own. "Keep me updated," Dennis said finally. His voice had changed. Not cold, not hostile, but different. The preoccupied quality was gone, and something more careful had taken its place. She said she would, and ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote the conversation down in her notebook. Not a transcript, but the key points. The date, the time, what she had said and what he had said and what neither of them had said. Her father's habit, inherited and now put to use. Then she turned to a new page and made a list of the next steps, in the order Margaret had prescribed and the conservator had implied. Authentication, documentation, formal estate accounting. And beneath those, a question she had been circling for days without writing down. What is the full extent of it? She had not yet lifted every item from the lower compartment. She had not yet seen everything the trunk held. The conservator's stillness on the video call had told her something about the upper section alone. The lower compartment remained only partially examined, its archival folders held briefly to a camera lens without being fully opened. The trunk had been locked for a reason. Her father had covered it with canvas and left it in a room where it would not be found unless someone looked with intention. She had looked. She was still looking. She thought about her brothers. She thought about Dennis's voice shifting on the phone, the careful quality that had replaced the preoccupied one. She thought about Ray, who she had not yet called, who would need to be told, who would respond in ways she was already preparing for. She thought about the professor standing in the storage unit with his gloved hands and his loupe, holding a sleeve up to the institutional light and going still in a way that had told her everything she needed to know about the direction of the conversation before he said a word. She thought about what the conservator had said, not individual items. The pause after that. I want you to have appropriate context. She closed the notebook and put it in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered most. Then she stood at the window of her apartment and looked out at the brick wall across the narrow gap between buildings, and beyond at the faint suggestion of the street below, where a car was passing with its headlights on in the early dark. She had kept the trunk. She had driven it 3 hours through winter and carried it up 3 flights of stairs on the days the elevator worked and stored it and locked it. And now she was circling it with lawyers and specialists, turning the situation in her hands the way her father had turned a loose spike in the track, applying the right attention to the right place before something gave way beneath weight it was no longer strong enough to carry. Whatever the trunk contained in full, she was getting closer to knowing. And with knowing, she understood now, would come everything else. The conversation she had not yet had. The claims not yet made. The attention that, once started, was very difficult to redirect. She was ready for none of it and prepared for all of it, which was, she suspected, exactly how her father had approached most things worth doing. She turned away from the window, checked the lock on the front door out of habit, and went to bed. The conservator called back 2 days later with an appointment date and a list of protocols for transporting selected items to the auction house's facility. The list was specific, detailed, and longer than Clara had expected. Each point on it confirmed what she already understood. This was not a routine valuation. This was the beginning of something that had its own particular weight, its own requirements, its own pace. She wrote down every instruction without question and made arrangements accordingly. 3 days before the transport appointment, Ray called her. She had been expecting it. Dennis had told him, which was inevitable, and Ray had waited 3 days before calling, which told her something about the internal conversation the two of them had been having in the interim. His opening was direct in the way that suggested he had rehearsed the opening. "Dennis says you had the trunk looked at." "Yes," she said. "And I'm still in the process," she said. "I don't have anything definitive yet." There was a pause. "Clara, what kind of specialists?" She did not answer that directly. "The kind that deal with this sort of thing," she said. "I'll tell you more when I know more." "We're all heirs to Dad's estate," he said. The word heirs had a particular sound when he said it, careful and deliberate, the way legal words sound when someone has been thinking about them. "I know that," she said. "The trunk was part of the estate." "You told me it wasn't worth hauling," she said. "Same calm. Same fact," restated. The pause that followed was longer than the one with Dennis. She heard something in it that she recognized from parent-teacher conferences with parents who had arrived certain of one thing and were now recalculating. "I'd like to be part of whatever process you're going through," he said finally. "I have a lawyer," she said. "When I have something to share, I'll share it through her." Another pause. "You have a lawyer," he repeated. "Yes," she said. The call ended shortly after. She wrote that down too. She was becoming her father in ways she had not anticipated, not as loss, but as continuation, the careful record of things that mattered extended forward through time by someone who understood why it mattered. The night before the transport appointment, she went to the storage unit one more time. She opened the trunk and looked at it fully. All of it, upper compartment and lower. She did not touch anything. She simply looked, the way she had looked at the house her father had lived in for 40 years, with the attention of someone who wanted to hold the full shape of something before its shape began to change. Because it was going to change. She understood that with complete clarity now. Whatever the conservator found in the controlled conditions of the auction house's facility, whatever the authentication process revealed, whatever the numbers turned out to be, the shape of her life was already shifting. Not dramatically, not yet. The way her father would have described it, not the collapse, but the first settled displacement of a track beginning to bow. She had kept the trunk. She had asked the right questions in the right order. She had found the right people and listened to them carefully. She had prepared. Now she stood at the edge of the knowing, and on the other side of it was everything she could not yet see. She closed the trunk, locked it, drove home, and slept better than she had in weeks. The auction house did not look like the kind of place that changed lives. That was the first thing Clara noticed when she arrived on a gray Tuesday morning with the trunk secured in a climate-controlled transport vehicle that the house had arranged. The building was unremarkable from the outside, a converted industrial structure in a part of the city that had been gradually reclaimed by professional firms and specialty services. There was no grand entrance, no indication on the facade of what took place inside. Just a street address and a small logo beside a door that required a keypad to open. She had expected grandeur, or at least the suggestion of it. She had not expected ordinary. The conservator met her in the receiving area, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Brennan, who was exactly as composed in person as she had been on the video call, her manner precise without being cold, her attention complete. She introduced Clara to two colleagues, a specialist in printed historical materials and an authentication technician whose name Clara did not catch because her attention was already moving to the cart they had prepared for the trunk, the careful way they had positioned it, the padding beneath and around. They did not rush. That was the second thing Clara noticed. Every movement in this building was deliberate, each action preceded by a moment of consideration. She watched them transfer selected items from the trunk into the examination room and understood that the pace itself was a form of respect, not for her, but for the objects. The examination room was not large. It held a long table covered in white material, adjustable overhead lighting that could be positioned precisely, and equipment she could not identify by name but understood by function. The room was sealed from outside light. The temperature was controlled. The air carried the same dry, slightly metallic quality she had noticed when the trunk first opened. Dr. Brennan asked if Clara wanted to remain in the room or wait outside. It was a genuine question, not a suggestion, and Clara said she would stay. What followed was 4 hours that Clara would spend the rest of her life being unable to fully describe. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened was almost entirely internal. The specialists worked. The items were examined. Notes were made. Equipment was consulted. Measurements were taken. The process was methodical and specific and carried none of the drama that the situation seemed to deserve from the outside. But inside it, something was accumulating. Not excitement, not the cinematic rush of discovery that stories about found fortunes sometimes described. Something quieter and more comprehensive, the steady arrival of certainty. The kind that does not announce itself, but simply settles, the way soil settles after rain, pressed down into the shape of what was always beneath it. She watched Dr. Brennan examine a single item for 11 minutes without looking away from it. She watched the materials specialist hold a sealed sleeve at 4 different angles under the controlled light, each time tilting it slightly differently, each time making a small mark in his notebook. She watched the authentication technician run a device along the edge of an item and study the reading without expression, then run it again, then a third time, then write 3 numbers down and underline them. At the 2-hour mark, Dr. Brennan set down what she was working on and looked at Clara directly. "I want to update you on where we are," she said. Clara nodded. The items we have examined from the upper compartment so far include 6 complete sheets and 4 partial sheets of issues that are, in some cases, either unrecorded in the major catalogs or recorded only in quantities that do not account for what you have here. She paused in a way that had become familiar, the pause of someone assembling language carefully before releasing it. That is significant in itself. But I want to come to the lower compartment, because that is where I need to be more direct with you. Clara said nothing. The items in the lower compartment include several pieces that I was able to provisionally identify during our video call, and that physical examination has now confirmed. Among them is an example of what collectors refer to by a designation I will explain in a moment, which I believe you need to understand before we go further. She laid one of the archival folders on the table, opened the item inside still in its sleeve. She positioned the overhead light above it and gestured for Clara to step closer. This, she said, is an inverted center error. The printing process produced a sheet in which the central image was applied upside down relative to the frame. It was a mistake that occurred during a single production run before being corrected. In the history of philately, errors of this kind are among the most significant discoveries that can be made because the number of surviving examples is finite and has been documented for decades. Clara looked at the item in the sleeve. The printing error was visible even to her once she understood what to look for. A small, precise, upside-down image in the center of the frame, the kind of mistake that would have been invisible to most people and catastrophic to the people responsible for catching it. The most documented example of this category, Dr. Brennan continued, is the inverted Jenny, a biplane printed upside down on an airmail stamp. It is one of the most recognized and valuable printing errors in the world. But that is not what you have here. She paused. What you have is something that predates the Jenny by several decades. An inverted center error from an earlier era, from a printing series that was believed to have produced fewer surviving errors than the Jenny, because the quality control of the period was, paradoxically, more thorough. The consensus in the literature has long been that 3, possibly 4 examples survived. 2 are in institutional collections. One sold at auction 18 years ago for a figure I will give you in a moment. She looked at Clara steadily. You have what appears to be a 4th. The room was very quiet. I want to be precise about the language I use, Dr. Brennan said. What I'm giving you right now is provisional authentication based on physical examination by 3 specialists with combined experience of over 60 years. Full authentication requires additional testing and cross-referencing of provenance records. That process will take time. But I have been in this field for 22 years, and I am telling you, with the appropriate professional qualifications, that I do not believe this item will fail full authentication. Clara looked at the upside-down image inside the sleeve. A tiny thing, a printing mistake made in a moment of inattention, corrected within minutes, preserved by some combination of chance and care through more time than she could fully account for. The item that sold 18 years ago, she said. What was the figure? Dr. Brennan told her. The number was large enough that Clara's mind did not immediately process it as money, but as an abstraction, a set of digits that required rearranging before they corresponded to anything real. She stood with the number settling through her in layers, each layer landing with a different weight. Then she thought about the rest of the trunk. The full sheets in the upper compartment, unrecorded in the catalogs. The other archival folders in the lower section, examined and noted and underlined 3 times by the authentication technician. What about the rest of it, she said. Dr. Brennan looked at her for a moment. That's what I need to explain to you, she said. And I need you to sit down for this part. Clara pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down. Dr. Brennan referred her notes. She spoke methodically, moving through the categories of what the trunk contained. The complete sheets, the partial sheets, the individual items, the errors, the rarities, the pieces that had appeared in literature only as references to items presumed destroyed or lost. She used language that was precise and qualified at every step, careful never to overstate, but the qualifications were scaffolding around a structure whose shape was unmistakable. When she finished, She set her notes down and folded her hands and looked at Clara with the same composed attention she had brought to every moment in this room. A full valuation, she said, will require the complete authentication process, provenance research, and market analysis. Those are not things I can give you today, but I can give you a preliminary range, understanding that it will shift as the process continues. Another pause. The items we have examined today, taken together, represent a collection that, based on comparable sales and current market conditions, we would place in a preliminary range of between $280 million and $320 million. Clara sat with that. The number did not hit her the way she might have expected. It did not arrive as joy or relief or the rush of something won. It arrived the way her father's death had arrived, not as a single blow, but as a slow comprehension, a gradual understanding of what the words actually contained. Her brain moved around the number carefully, the way she moved around the trunk on the first morning, looking at it from different angles before she touched it. $280 million to $320 million. In a locked trunk, under a canvas tarpaulin, in the corner of a room in her father's house. Her brothers had told her to burn it. She sat in the examination room of the auction house and looked at the inverted center error in its sealed sleeve on the white table and thought about Dennis's voice on the phone, the way it had changed quality when she said she had the trunk looked at. She thought about Ray saying we are all heirs to Dad's estate with the word heirs given its particular careful weight. She thought about the 40-year ledger in her father's kitchen drawer and the spiral-bound pad on the counter and the handwritten notation in the margin. Furnace repair, necessary. She thought about her car with the dent in the rear quarter panel. She thought about the radiator in her apartment that knocked through winters. She thought about 11 years at Harlan County Middle School and the salary that was enough to live on with discipline and not quite enough to do anything beyond that. She thought about her father walking the track in all weathers. She thought about what he had said once on the phone during one of their Sunday calls. In the understated way, he said everything that mattered. The thing about valuable things is they don't announce themselves. That was the whole point of being careful. She had thought at the time that he was talking about his work. She sat for a long time after Dr. Brennan finished speaking. The specialists gave her that time without comment, moving quietly around the edges of the room, continuing their notes, respecting the fact that some information required space before it could be responded to. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was the same voice she had always had. Steady, measured, no higher or lower than necessary. What we do next, she said. Dr. Brennan outlined the process. Full authentication would begin immediately for the priority items. Provenance research would run concurrently, tracing the history of each piece as far back as records allowed. The trunk itself would remain in secure storage at the facility. A formal engagement with the auction house will be drafted, subject to Clara's legal review, because Dr. Brennan said that part specifically and without prompting, subject to your legal counsel's review, before any further steps were taken. Clara said she had legal counsel. Dr. Brennan said she was glad to hear it. Clara drove home that afternoon through the city in a state she would later describe to herself simply as altered. Not changed, because she was the same person who had driven to the storage unit in a car with a dented quarter panel and eaten lunch at her desk and stayed late for a struggling student. She was still that person completely, but the world around her had shifted in some fundamental way, the way the ground shifts when the thing beneath it turns out to be different from what you assumed. Not collapse, displacement, a settling into the true shape of what was actually there. She called Margaret Osei from the car, using the hands-free connection, and gave her a precise account of the day. Margaret listened without interruption. When Clara finished with the preliminary range, there was a pause that was different from other pauses, shorter but denser. "All right," Margaret said. Her voice was the same professional calm it always was, but there was something underneath it that Clara recognized as alertness. "I need you to send me the auction house's initial documentation as soon as they send it. And I need you to understand something." "Yes," Clara said. When a preliminary figure of that magnitude enters an estate proceeding that is still open, the dynamics of that proceeding change. Not necessarily against you, but they change. Your brothers will need to be formally notified of the trunk's estimated value as part of the estate accounting. And once they are, the informal verbal agreement about you keeping it will be scrutinized. Clara had been expecting this. She had been expecting it since the phone call with Dennis, since the changed quality in his voice, since the word airs in Ray's mouth. "What I need to do," she said. "Let me do what I do," Margaret said. "Stay available, stay quiet publicly, and trust the process." Clara said she could do that. She had been doing that her whole life, in one form or another. The notification went to her brothers the following week through Margaret's office. It was formal, precise, and contained the preliminary valuation range from the auction house. It documented the verbal agreement regarding the trunk, supported by the written record of the conversation with Dennis that Clara had noted in her notebook on the night it occurred. It established the timeline of discovery and authentication clearly, demonstrating that the trunk's value had not been known at the time of its removal from the estate. The response from Ray's attorney arrived 4 days later. It was what Margaret had expected and prepared for. The claim was that the trunk, as a physical item belonging to the estate at the time of its removal, along with its contents, should be considered estate property subject to equal distribution among the 3 heirs. Ray's position was that Clara had removed the item with knowledge of potential value and had failed to disclose that knowledge to the other heirs before doing so. Clara read the document at her kitchen table and felt something that surprised her with its clarity. Not anger, not hurt, not the complicated grief of a sibling dispute. Something simpler and more settled. The recognition of a thing she had already known was coming, arriving exactly as she had prepared for it to arrive. She called Margaret and said she had received it. Margaret said she had received it too. She also said that Ray's claim had a significant weakness at its foundation, and that she had been waiting for it to arrive so she could address it properly. The weakness was documented. On the evening that Clara had found the trunk and told Dennis she wanted to keep it, Dennis had sent a text to Ray. She did not know this at the time. She only knew it because Dennis, in a moment she had not anticipated, forwarded that text to Margaret's office 2 weeks after the formal notification. The text said, "Clara wants the old trunk from Dad's back room. Let her have it. Probably nothing in it." Dennis had not done it out of loyalty to Clara. She understood that. He had done it because he was a practical man, and practical men, when they understand which way a situation is moving, tend to position themselves toward the side with the stronger footing. He had said what he'd said in writing at the time that he'd said it. What that text described was voluntary relinquishment, informed by their shared assessment of the trunk's likely value, before any specialist had been consulted. Ray's attorney's claim dissolved under the weight of it. Not immediately. These things did not happen immediately, and Clara had learned, through the weeks of process and patience, that immediately was never the relevant time frame. But it dissolved the way things dissolve when the ground beneath them turned out to be less solid than assumed. Gradually, then completely, Margaret handled the legal proceedings with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. She filed responses, presented documentation, and established the timeline with the clarity of someone who had been given every tool they needed because the person at the center of the case had been taking notes from the beginning. Ray attended a mediation session. Clara did not see him before or after it. She waited in a room with Margaret and a cup of coffee that went cold, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she had developed over years of waiting for meetings to end and students to finish exams and seasons to turn. The mediation produced a settlement that acknowledged Clara's ownership of the trunk and its contents as having been established through voluntary verbal and written agreement prior to the discovery of its value. A financial consideration was negotiated for the estate, a figure that represented a fraction of the trunk's preliminary valuation, but that was, in absolute terms, more money than the house itself was worth. It was fair in the way that fair sometimes looked from the outside like less than what someone wanted, and from the inside like the only reasonable resolution to a situation that had never needed to become a conflict. Ray accepted it. His attorney recommended it, and Ray, whatever else could be said of him, understood the counsel of people he was paying for their judgment. Dennis had not contested anything. He called Clara 2 days after the mediation and asked how she was. She said she was fine. He said he was sorry about how things had unfolded. She said she understood. They spoke for 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the trunk, about the house, which had sold, about a trip Dennis was planning, about the spring and the way their father's garden looked in early April when the tomatoes were just beginning to emerge. It was a conversation that had nothing complicated in it, and both of them seemed to need that. The full authentication process took 4 months. During that time, Clara continued to teach. She entered grades and wrote recommendations and attended department meetings and stayed late for students who needed her to stay late. She ate lunch at her desk on most days. The radiator knocked through the end of winter. The elevator in her building worked on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and by appointment on weekends. She did not tell anyone at work about the trunk. She did not tell neighbors or friends in the casual way that news of good fortune sometimes escaped before people understood its implications. She talked to Margaret, to Dr. Brennan, and on 2 occasions to the materials specialist who had begun the provenance research. She kept her notebook. She wrote down everything that mattered in the order it mattered, the same way her father had kept his ledger. The provenance research was the part that occupied her most deeply during those months. Not the numbers, which had settled into a form of abstraction she held without urgency, but the story, where the trunk had been, how it had traveled, whose hands it had passed through before arriving in the corner room of a house in a small town, covered by a canvas tarpaulin, tended by a man who had worked the railroad and believed that things deserved to be tracked. What the research revealed came in pieces, the way all true things come, not as a single disclosure, but as an accumulation. The trunk had originated in Europe, that much the shipping designation had suggested, and the provenance team confirmed it through transit records and archival cross-referencing. It had been brought to the United States in the middle of the 20th century by someone who the records identified by initials only, a practice common to private collectors of that period who prefer discretion to documentation. From there, the trail became less clear, passing through several owners, some of whom had understood what they had and some of whom clearly had not. The trail arrived at Thomas Meade through a transaction that predated Clara's birth by several years. A private sale, documented in correspondence that the provenance team located in a secondary archive. Her father had paid what the research described as a modest sum for a trunk of printed materials from a retiring collector who had not fully inventoried its contents. The seller had described it as a lot of old stamps, mixed provenance, some possibly interesting. Her father had taken it home, locked it, and said nothing to anyone for the rest of his life. Clara sat with that for a long time when Dr. Brennan communicated the provenance findings. Her father had known. Not the full extent, perhaps. Perhaps not the number, the $300 million weight of what he had carried quietly through his daily life. But he had known it was worth locking, worth covering, worth protecting from the casual inventory of people who had not learned to look at small things carefully. He had worked the railroad and kept a ledger and watched the road from his porch on summer evenings and said, in his understated way, that valuable things did not announce themselves. And he had locked a trunk and covered it with canvas and left it for whoever came to the room with the right kind of attention. She had been to that room looking for nothing in particular and had found it anyway. Not because she had known, because she had looked. The final authentication report was delivered to Margaret's office on a morning in early autumn. Clara received the summary over a call with both Dr. Brennan and Margaret present, a conference call that lasted just over an hour, and that Clara spent sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook open and her pen in her hand, writing nothing. The final authenticated valuation of the trunk's contents was $303 million. Not a range, not a preliminary estimate. A figure supported by full authentication documentation, provenance confirmation, and market analysis prepared by the auction house's valuation team in consultation with independent specialists. A number that corresponded to the physical objects in the sealed sleeves and the archival folders, to the complete sheets and the partial sheets, and the inverted center error, and the items that had appeared in the literature only as references to things believed lost, to the thing her brothers had said was probably empty. $303 million. She wrote it down in her notebook. She wrote it the way her father would have written it, with the date and the source and the context. She looked at it for a moment, then closed the notebook and set it on the table and looked out the window at the brick wall across the narrow gap between buildings. She did not feel the way she had imagined she might feel if such a number were ever attached to her name. She did not feel the sudden brightness of a life made easy, the rush of a problem solved. She felt, instead, something that was harder to name and closer to what she had felt standing in front of the trunk the first time she opened it. The weight of something real, settling into the shape of what it actually was. She thanked Dr. Brennan and Margaret. She ended the call. She sat at the table for a while in the quiet of the apartment. Then she stood and made coffee and stood at the counter the way her father had stood, eyes moving to the window, thinking about what came next. What came next was not dramatic. It was not swift or simple or free of complication. But it arrived the way things arrived when they were prepared for rather than rushed toward. Margaret guided the financial and legal structure with the same precision she had brought to every stage of the process. Clara engaged tax advisors and financial specialists who were recommended and vetted with the same thoroughness she had applied to everyone else. She did not act quickly. She did not act under pressure. She acted from a position that her father would have recognized as the only stable one, the position of someone who understood what they had before they decided what to do with it. The first thing she paid off was the remainder of her father's estate costs. What had been owed was settled, and what had been promised to her brothers through the mediation was transferred. She did this without ceremony and without tallying it against what had been said to her or what the trunk might have cost her if she had listened. The accounting her father had kept for 40 years had never been about keeping score. It had been about knowing where things stood. The second thing she did was clear her own debts. Not impulsively, not all at once, but in the order that made structural sense. The credit balance that had persisted through thin years. The car. The small amount left on a personal loan she had taken out 4 years earlier when the heating unit in her apartment failed in February and the landlord took 3 months to address it. When those were gone, the absence of them was not loud. It was quiet, the way the removal of the sound you have long since stopped noticing is quiet. She noticed it mostly in the mornings, in the way she moved through the first moments of the day, without the low, persistent calculation that had accompanied every morning for years. The subtraction of that weight was not triumph. It was restoration, the return of something that should not have been absent. She did not quit teaching that year. This surprised people who learned about it, the few she told, who assumed that the logical sequence of such a discovery was the immediate exit from everything that had preceded it. She explained it in different ways to different people, but the truest version was the one she gave to Margaret on the day the funds were fully transferred into the account structure they had established. "The students need consistency," she said, "and I need to finish the year." Margaret said she understood. What Clara meant, and did not say in full, was that she was not yet ready to stop being the person she had been. Not because that person had been diminished, not because she resented what her life had looked like before the trunk opened, but because the transition from one life to another deserved the same care she had given every other transition she had navigated. It deserved to be done deliberately, in the right sequence, for the right reasons. Her father's daughter making the kind of decision her father would have made. She finished the academic year. She attended the end-of-year ceremony and watched students she had known for 3 years walk across a stage and receive acknowledgments of a transition she understood from the inside, the particular feeling of a chapter ending that had been whole enough to be worth the time it took. She did not cry at the ceremony, but she felt the full weight of the room in a way she had not felt it in 6 years of attending the same event, and she understood that this too was a form of completion. She submitted her resignation in the spring. She was careful with the letter, the same way she was careful with everything that mattered. She thanked the school with a specificity that made clear she had paid attention. She named colleagues she respected, students who had stayed in her mind, moments that had mattered in ways that would not be visible on a performance review. She gave 3 months' notice, which was longer than required, and which reflected her understanding that her leaving would create work for others and that work deserved time to be absorbed. Her students knew before she told them officially, because students always know things before they are told officially. A girl named Priya, who had spent the entire year asking questions that were too large for the assignment, waited for Clara after class one afternoon and said, "Is it true you're leaving?" Clara said it was. Priya looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a 12-year-old working through something too complicated for her vocabulary. Then she said, "Is it because of the thing with the trunk?" Clara looked at her. Priya shrugged, which was the gesture of someone who had heard things and was testing their accuracy. "Partly," Clara said. "It's time for something different." Priya said, "What are you going to do?" Clara said she wasn't entirely sure yet, which was true, and which Priya seemed to find less satisfying than she had hoped. Then Clara said, "I'm going to be careful about it," and that seemed to satisfy her more, though not for a reason she could have articulated. She moved out of the apartment at the end of the summer. She did not move into something that announced itself, not a house designed to make the scale of her change legible to anyone passing it. She found a place with a garden, modest by the standards of what was now available to her, but real in all the ways that mattered, with soil she could work in and a morning light that came through undimmed by brick walls. She moved her things carefully and set them in the rooms without rushing and let the space become familiar before she made any decisions about what should change. She did not replace the car immediately. It seemed important to her, for reasons she did not entirely explain to anyone, to keep the car for a while longer. The dent in the rear quarter panel stayed. The engine worked. The radio still picked up the 2 stations she listened to. She drove it to the storage facility to collect the last of her things, and she sat in the parking lot for a moment before going in, the same way she had sat there the night after the professor's visit, looking at the door of the unit with the attention of someone marking a moment. The trunk was no longer there. It was in the auction house's secure storage, beginning the process of being properly cataloged and eventually placed before the world that would understand what it was. Clara had thought carefully about whether to sell or retain the collection, and she had decided, after months of deliberation and several conversations with Dr. Brennan and Margaret, and one long Sunday afternoon of sitting in her father's garden, now gone but present in memory, that the collection belonged to the world that would appreciate it in the way she could not. Not out of indifference to it, but out of respect. Her father had locked the trunk, but he had not hidden it forever. He had left it for someone to find. She was the someone. What she did with it next was her own contribution to the chain of careful choices that had brought it to this moment. The proceeds from the sale, when it came, would be handled the way she handled everything, with attention, with preparation, and with a ledger. She would fund a scholarship in her father's name. She had decided this quietly, early, before the authentication was complete, and it had not changed. Not a grand endowment with her father's name on a building, but a scholarship for students in the county where she had taught, young people in the specific kind of circumstances she recognized from inside, the kind where the margin was thin and the cost of a mistake compounded quickly. Students who had learned to need less than they deserved, and who deserved to have someone tell them that need was not a permanent condition. She planned to keep teaching in some form, though not in the way she had before. She had conversations about a foundation, about programs that put books and attention into rooms where they were scarce. She moved through these ideas the way she moved through everything, not rushing, not committing before she understood, asking the right questions of the right people, and listening completely when they answered. On the first anniversary of her father's death, she drove to the town where the house had been. The house itself belonged to other people now. She did not stop there. She drove to the cemetery where her father was buried beside her mother, and she stood at the grave in the February cold and did not speak aloud, because that had not been their way. She stood quietly and felt the full weight of everything, not as a burden, but as a presence, the accumulated fact of a life lived carefully and the choices it had made possible. Her father had noticed a fractured tie where others saw only track. He had documented what others considered too small to record. He had locked a trunk and covered it carefully and never said a word about it to anyone, which was either a profound act of restraint or a belief, quiet and absolute, that the right person would eventually come to the right room and look with the right kind of attention. She thought about what she had said to Priya, the 12-year-old who asked questions too large for her assignment. "I'm going to be careful about it." She had meant the next stage of her life, the decisions ahead, the use of what she had been given by chance and kept by choice. But standing in the February cold at her father's grave, she understood that careful was not a method. It was an inheritance, passed without ceremony from a man who walked railroad track with his eyes open to a daughter who looked at things before she discarded them. She had been careful with the trunk, with the experts, with the legal process, with the teaching and the students and the resignation and the move. She had been careful the way her father had been careful, not out of fear, but out of respect for the fact that things deserved to be looked at before they were decided. And from that care, a life had come open that had been locked for years. Not by poverty alone, not by the narrow margin of a teacher's salary in a building with a broken elevator, but by the accumulated weight of not knowing what was possible, of moving through days without the particular kind of stillness that comes when pressure is removed. That stillness was what she was learning now. The way she had watched students learn things, slowly, with reversals and confusions and the occasional morning where everything was clear. She drove home in the car with the dented quarter panel and arrived as the light was changing from the thin winter quality to the particular gray of early evening, and she sat in the driveway for a moment and looked at the garden, frozen now and patient, waiting for the season that would come, because seasons did, and she thought that she would plant tomatoes in the spring. More than she could eat alone. She would give them away to neighbors who might or might not thank her properly, and it would not matter either way, because that was not why her father had grown them, and it was not why she would. She went inside, made coffee, and opened her notebook to a new page. At the top of it she wrote the date, and beneath the date she wrote nothing for a while, only held the pen and looked at the clean page the way she had looked at the open trunk on the first morning, before she reached in, before she understood, in the storage unit light with the smell of sealed time in the air. Then she began to write. Not plans, not figures, not the careful accounting of what had been and what was owed. She wrote the story of the trunk, from the first morning in the corner room to the February grave to the driveway in the changing light. She wrote it the way her father might have written in a margin. Furnace repair, necessary. Simple, true, a record of something that had happened and mattered enough to be preserved. She did not know how long it would take to finish. She did not know all of what it would contain. But she wrote carefully, which was the only way she knew how to do anything, and she did not stop when the coffee grew cold or the light in the room changed or the evening settled fully around the house with its garden and its waiting soil and its morning light that came in clean. Her brothers had told her to burn the trunk. She had kept it, driven it 3 hours through winter, carried it upstairs, looked at it until she understood what it was, and then protected it with the patience of someone who had learned that valuable things did not announce themselves. $303 million had been in the corner of a room under a canvas tarpaulin. Her father had known what he had, and now at last so did she. The auction took place on a Thursday in October in a room Clara did not attend. She had made that decision quietly, the way she made most decisions, after sitting with it long enough to understand what it was actually about. Dr. Brennan had extended the invitation in the particular way specialists extend invitations to owners of significant collections, with warmth and the implicit understanding that presence was not required but would be appreciated. Clara thanked her and said she would watch the live feed from home. Dr. Brennan said she understood, and in her voice was the tone of someone who genuinely did. Clara set up her laptop on the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the notebook open beside it. She had not written anything in the notebook that morning. She left the page blank, which was unusual for her, and which she understood as a form of honesty. Some mornings did not have notes yet. They had to be lived before they could be recorded. The auction began at 10 in the morning. She watched the opening procedures on the screen, the room filling with the particular category of people who attended events of this kind, collectors and dealers and institutional representatives, and a scattering of observers who were there simply because something significant was happening, and significance drew people the way light drew moths, not always for reasons they could name. The collection was presented in lots that Dr. Brennan and her team had organized over months, each grouping calibrated to the market with the same care the items themselves had once been organized inside the trunk's green-line compartments. Clara watched the first lot open and felt something she had not anticipated, a kind of distance from the proceedings that was not detachment, but perspective, the sense of watching something that had once been entirely hers move into a larger current, where it would belong to the world in a way that her corner room and locked trunk had only ever held in potential. The bidding moved quickly on some lots and slowly on others, pausing in the particular suspended way that high-stakes rooms paused when numbers climbed past points of comfortable certainty in a territory where only commitment remained. She watched the screen and drank her coffee and did not feel what she thought she might feel, which was loss. What she felt instead was closer to completion. The thing her father had gathered and locked and preserved had been seen. It had been understood. It was being recognized by people who knew what recognition required. The inverted center aerosoled in the third hour. The room on the screen went still in a way she recognized because she had stood in rooms that went still in exactly that way, and she understood it as the collective breath of people in the presence of something that did not appear often. The final bid was a number she watched appear on the screen and did not write down immediately, not because it was too large to record, but because she wanted to hold it for a moment in the specific way she had held the sleeve on the morning the trunk first opened, with both hands and without rushing toward what it meant. She wrote it down eventually. She wrote it with the date and the time and a single word in the margin beside it. Dad. The full results came by the end of the day. Dr. Brennan called that evening, her voice carrying a warmth that had not been present in the professional precision of their early conversations. The warmth of someone who had spent months in proximity to something remarkable and was now watching it arrive at the place it had been traveling toward. The total figure was within the authenticated range. It was, by any measure available to Clara, more than she had needed to be told. She already knew the shape of it. She had known it since the autumn afternoon. She sat at the table and looked at $303 million written in her own handwriting. She thanked Dr. Brennan and meant it completely, the way she thanked people who had done real work on her behalf, with the specificity that made clear she had been paying attention to the work and not only to the result. After the call, she sat in the kitchen for a while in the particular quiet of a day that had finished something long in progress. Outside the window, the garden was settling into the stripped-down version of itself that late October produced. The soil turned and resting, the beds cleared of what the season had given and spent. She had planted the tomatoes in May, as she had promised herself she would. They had grown with the indifferent abundance that tomatoes produced when the soil was given basic attention, and she had given away more than she kept, leaving bags of them on neighbors' porches without announcement, the way her father had distributed them from his garden to people who did not always remember to say thank you. One neighbor had knocked on her door in August, an older woman named Iris who walked with a cane and had lived in the house at the end of the road since before Clara had moved in. She held a bag of tomatoes and said, "These are yours, aren't they?" It wasn't a question. Clara said they were. Iris looked at her for a moment with the appraising attention of someone who had lived long enough to assess people quickly and without apology. Then she said, "Your father taught you that?" Clara said yes. She did not ask how Iris knew. Some things were simply apparent to people who had been paying attention long enough. The scholarship fund opened for applications in January. Clara had worked through the structure of it with the same methodical care she had brought to every stage of what the trunk had set in motion. It was not a large institution, not named for a building, not administered by a board of people who required ceremony to function. It was a direct fund, managed through an established community foundation, designed to reach students in the specific geography of the county where she had taught, prioritizing young people whose circumstances she recognized because she had grown up in the outline of them and spent 11 years teaching inside them. The first round of applications arrived in February. She read every one herself. She had been told this was unusual for a fund of this kind, that the volume of applications would eventually make it impractical, and that the foundation had staff whose role was precisely this kind of review. She acknowledged this information and continued reading them herself. She was not ready yet to delegate the part that felt most like the reason the fund existed, the recognition of a specific kind of effort made under a specific kind of pressure, the thing she could see in an application the way her father had seen a loose spike in a length of rail. Not because she had been told where to look, but because she already knew. The first group of recipients was 12 students. She did not attend the announcement ceremony, again by deliberate choice, again for reasons she understood more clearly than she could easily explain. The scholarship was not about her presence in a room receiving gratitude. It was about the absence of a particular kind of obstacle from 12 people's forward movement. Those were different things, and collapsing them would have been a mistake she recognized too well to make. She did write each recipient a letter, handwritten, specific, addressed to what she had learned about each person from reading their application rather than to a general idea of what a scholarship recipient deserved to hear. She did not say anything about the trunk or its contents or the sequence of events that had made the fun possible. That was not the relevant information. The relevant information was what she had seen in their pages, the evidence of effort sustained under conditions that made effort harder than it needed to be, and her genuine belief that the next stage of their lives warranted the support she was now in a position to provide. One of the recipients wrote back. A boy named Marcus who was planning to study civil engineering and who had written in his application about the water infrastructure problems in the rural part of the county where he had grown up, the way the pipes ran brown after heavy rain, the way the adults in his town had learned to manage around it rather than expect it to be fixed. His letter back to Clara was 2 paragraphs, handwritten on notebook paper, the handwriting the kind that came from someone who wrote quickly because they had more thoughts than time. He said he had not expected a personal letter. He said it made the thing feel real in a way the official notification had not quite managed. He said he was going to fix the pipes. Clara read the letter twice and put in the notebook between 2 pages she left otherwise blank, a space she reserved for things that did not need to be surrounded by other words to hold their meaning. She thought about Marcus sometimes in the months that followed, the way she thought about certain students long after they had left her classroom, not with worry or sentimentality, but with a directional interest, the sense of wanting to know where the thing she had witnessed the beginning of eventually arrived. She did not follow up. That was not how this worked. The gift was the beginning, and the rest belonged to him. Spring came back to the garden with the patient reliability that spring had always brought, indifferent to everything that had occurred in the intervening year and interested only in what the soil was prepared to receive. Clara turned the beds in March and amended them with compost she had been building since the autumn and planned the tomatoes the way she planned most things, with more thought than was strictly necessary and a genuine interest in the outcome. She bought a new car in April, not an extravagant one, something with good safety ratings and enough room in the back for the things she occasionally needed to transport, the bags of compost, the flat of seedlings, the occasional delivery she made for a local food pantry she had begun volunteering with on Saturday mornings. The dented car had finally reached the point where the mechanic used the word reliable with a slight hesitation that told her his confidence in the word had limits. She drove the old car to the mechanic for the last time on a Wednesday morning and sat in the waiting room while he gave her his assessment. And when he finished, she told him she appreciated the honesty and that she would be leaving the car with him rather than investing further. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone adjusting an assumption. She thanked him for the years of maintenance, which surprised him enough that he said "you're welcome" with a slight delay, and she drove away in a loner and did not look back. The new car did not have a dent in the quarter panel. She noticed the absence of it the first morning she parked in the driveway and walked toward the house without registering the familiar shape. It was a small thing, the smallest possible version of what had changed. But it was the version she kept returning to in the weeks after, the way she returned to the note she had written the morning after the auction, the single word in the margin beside the number. Not because the dent had been significant, but because its absence was the most legible measure of a distance traveled that she could hold in her hands and examine without the complication of language. Everything else was too large for that. $300 million, a locked trunk, the inverted image of an airplane in the center of a frame. The dent was small enough to understand directly. She understood it directly on a Saturday morning in May while the garden was producing its first green suggestions of the season and the light was coming in at the angle that made everything look more possible than it had the day before. She stood at the kitchen window with coffee and looked at the car, then at the garden and then at the light, and she felt with the fullness of someone who has learned to receive a thing without qualifying it into something smaller, that she was exactly where she was. Not where she had been with its specific weight. Not where she was going with its open uncertainty. Here, in the morning, with the garden coming in and the light doing what light did and the notebook on the table behind her, its current page half filled with the ordinary record of an ordinary life that had turned out to contain, in the corner of a room under a canvas cover, something that no one had bothered to look at. Until she did. There was a cardboard box in the equipment shed that she had not opened until spring. She had seen it during her first week on the property, pushed to the back of the shelf behind rusted hinges and a coil of irrigation line that had not been used in years. It was sealed with packing tape that had dried and curled at the edges, her father's handwriting on the top in permanent marker, the letters faded but legible. It said only Eastern Quarter. She had noted it and moved on, the way you move past things when there is more immediate work to be done, telling yourself you will come back to it when there is time. She came back to it in April, a week after Dr. Anand's first visit, and then she sat down on the shed floor and did not move for a long time. Inside the box were her father's field notebooks. Not one, 11 of them, each labeled on the cover with a date range, the earliest beginning in the late 1970s and the latest ending in the year before his death. They were the kind of notebooks that farmers used before everything went digital, small and durable, their covers stiffened by weather and repeated handling, their pages dense with entries written in the same controlled hand she recognized from the will. He had used a mechanical pencil throughout, replacing the lead as it wore down, the early entries darker and the later ones lighter as his preferred lead grade shifted over time. She read them in order, starting with the earliest, sitting on the shed floor until her back required her to move to the flat rock outside, and then on the trailer steps when the light changed, and then at the kitchen table through the evening and into the following morning. Lily found her there at 6 a.m., with the third notebook open and the coffee cold beside her, and asked if she had slept. Mara said she had not. She said she was reading something important. Lily looked at the notebooks and said, without being told anything, "Are those Grandpa's?" Mara said yes. Lily poured herself cereal and sat across the table and did not interrupt. The notebooks were not diaries. They contained no personal reflections, no emotional disclosures, no statements of intention or purpose. They were observation logs, methodical and spare, recording exactly what Eldon had said a man with 40 years on the same ground would record. Weather conditions, seasonal behavior of the spring, flow rate estimates made the same way Mara had made her first estimates, by watching the water move across a measured distance. Her father had done this at the same intervals across 4 decades, creating a data set that no formal study had ever captured, a longitudinal record of a karst spring's behavior through droughts and wet cycles and the slow shift of the region's water table over time. He had noted the drought years most carefully. In the dry summer of 1988, when surface water across the county had either vanished or reduced to unreliable trickles, he had recorded the spring's daily flow rate without a single disruption. In a dry stretch in 1995 that Mara remembered vaguely as the summer the creek at the bottom of the property had gone to mud, the spring had not changed. He had underlined the entry for that day, the only underlining she found in any of the 11 notebooks, and written a single note beside it in parentheses that said, consistent with pressurized source. He had not been guessing. He had been confirming again and again, across 40 years of patient observation, what he had begun to suspect very early on. The spring was not fed by rainfall or surface accumulation. It was fed by something below, something that operated on a different and deeper logic, something that did not respond to surface conditions because it was not subject to them. She found his first notation of the pressurized source theory in the third notebook, dating to the mid-1980s. He had written it as a question: if the source is pressurized, what is the extent of the system? He had not answered the question in that entry, or in the notebooks that followed. He had simply continued observing, continued recording, letting the data accumulate without forcing it to conclusions it could not yet support. He had the patience of someone who understood that certain answers required more time than a single season or a single decade, and who was prepared to wait. She thought about that patience. She had always understood her father as a practical man, a man of routine and discipline, and the kind of quiet, stubborn competence that kept a farm running across multiple generations of uncertain weather and uncertain markets. She had not known, until the notebooks, that he had also been conducting a private scientific inquiry for 40 years, without formal training, without institutional support, using only a mechanical pencil and a series of small notebooks, and the unchanging presence of the spring. She thought about what it had cost him to keep it quiet. He had known, or strongly suspected, what was under that hillside. He had known it for years, perhaps decades, before the end. And he had told no one, not her brother, not her sister, not any neighbor or buyer or county official who might have approached the property with interest. He had protected it in silence because he understood, with the same practical intelligence that ran everything else he did, that knowledge of that kind, disclosed too early or to the wrong person, would not benefit the person who deserved to benefit from it. He had waited for the right person to be ready, and then he had made his arrangement in the only binding form available to him, in a will, in his own handwriting, and he had trusted the rest to her. She kept the notebooks in the study of the new house, beside the filled-up notebook of her own, arranged in chronological order on a dedicated shelf. She considered them part of the property's documentation in the same way the certified survey and the water rights transfer were documentation. They were evidence of a different kind, not legal evidence, but personal evidence, the record of a man paying attention to his land with the consistency and care that most people reserve for things they love. The Municipal Water Authority broke ground on the access infrastructure in the following March, 14 months after the transaction had closed. They were building a pump station in a collection point at the lower edge of the eastern quarter, where the subsurface void system came closest to a viable extraction depth, and a pipeline that would run along the county road to the regional distribution network. It was a significant construction project by county standards, large enough to require permits and traffic management, and a crew of 20 that arrived in the early mornings and left before dark. Mara watched the groundbreaking from the east-facing porch. It was a clear morning, the kind that March sometimes produced in that county, cold and bright and specific, the light hitting everything at an angle that made ordinary things look considered. The machinery moved across the lower edge of the hillside with the unhurried efficiency of professionals doing work they knew well. She had been told, in the pre-construction briefing, that the surface extraction point will be placed to avoid disturbing the spring or the limestone outcroppings above it. The agreement included a preservation clause that she and Clara had insisted on, specifying that the spring's natural emergence point and the 20 meters of ground immediately surrounding it were to remain undisturbed in perpetuity. The Water Authority had accepted the clause without objection. Their interest was in the deep extraction, not the surface feature, and the surface feature had no bearing on their operational requirements. The spring would continue. She had made sure of that. Eldon came by during the second week of construction, unannounced, as was his way. He stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the machinery for a while without comment. Then he said the pump station's placement was sensible and that the geotechnical team had read the terrain correctly, which he said as a form of professional acknowledgement rather than a compliment, because Eldon distinguished between the two. He asked how the spring was behaving. She said it was unchanged. He nodded as though this was what he had expected, which it probably was. Before he left, he said something she had not expected. He said her father had called him once, a long time ago, when Mara would have been a teenager, to ask a question about karst hydrology. He said he had answered the question as well as he could, and that Walter had thanked him and not called again. He said he had wondered, for years afterward, why a man farming that particular piece of ground had wanted to know about pressurized aquifer systems, and that he had eventually concluded the answer was probably the obvious one. Mara looked at him. He said he knew what he had. He just needed to know what to call it. She looked at the hillside. The machinery moved across the lower edge in its patient way. She said, "Did you know when I called you? Did you already suspect?" Eldon thought about this with the deliberateness he brought to most things. He said he had had an idea. He said the name Voss, attached to a question about that particular piece of ground, had struck him as meaningful. He said he had come out to look, because he had been curious for 30 years. He went back to his truck and drove down the county road, and Mara stood on the porch a while longer, looking at the hillside and thinking about the long, quiet chain of people who had known or suspected or guessed and had chosen, each for their own reasons, to handle the knowledge carefully. Dr. Anand's paper was published in the late autumn, in a peer-reviewed hydrogeological journal with a circulation that was narrow by popular standards and significant within its field. The paper documented the Voss spring formation, which was the name Dr. Anand had given the system in the absence of any prior official designation, and presented the acoustic and resistivity survey data alongside the certified borehole results and the volumetric estimates. The abstract described it as one of the most significant undocumented karst aquifer systems identified in the region in the past 4 decades. In the acknowledgement section, Dr. Anand thanked the landowner for access and cooperation and noted that the discovery had been made possible by the sustained observation of the site over multiple decades by the previous owner, whose field records had provided a longitudinal data set of unusual completeness. She had asked Dr. Anand to include that. She had felt it was important that the record reflect who had actually done the primary work and for how long, and with what instruments, which were a mechanical pencil and 11 small notebooks and 40 years of mornings on a hillside. The first bursary recipients at the County Community College were announced in January. 2 students in agricultural sciences whose applications had been selected by a small committee that Mara had helped constitute, but did not sit on, because she had wanted the selections to be made by people better positioned to judge merit in those fields than she was. She attended the announcement, which was a modest event in the college's main building, and she shook the students' hands and did not say much, because the gesture was not about her. One of the students was a young woman from the eastern part of the county who was studying soil science and had written, in her application essay, about wanting to understand the ground she had grown up on. The other was a young man whose family had farmed the same land for 3 generations and who wanted to study hydrology. She shook his hand and said she thought that was a good thing to study. He said he had heard about the Voss spring formation in one of his classes and had been reading about it. She said that was where it had started for her too. Reading about something she did not yet understand, trying to learn the language of a place she had been given and did not yet know how to see. He looked at her with the particular attentiveness of someone who is young enough to still find the paths that led people to certain outcomes genuinely interesting. He said, "Did you know what it was when you first found it?" She said no. She said she had known only that it was there and that it had been there for a long time and that it mattered, and that the knowing had come later, slowly, the way most knowing came. He nodded. He said thank you. She drove home on the county road in the January dark, the curve going by without notice, the farmhouse lights visible through the bare trees from a quarter-mile away. She pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment in the quiet of the car, the engine ticking as it cooled, the county dark and still around her. She thought about what her father had understood at the end of all those mornings, after all those notebooks, after 40 years of the same fissure in the same limestone and the same quiet water. She thought it was probably not about the money, which he had known was there without knowing the figure, and which had never been the point for him in any case. She thought it was about something simpler and more durable, about the satisfaction of understanding a place on its own terms, of learning its language through patience rather than force, of being the kind of person who could receive a thing quietly and tend it faithfully and trust that the right moment for it would eventually come. She got out of the car. The east-facing porch was lit, and through the kitchen window, she could see the light on and Lily moving around inside, probably making tea with the careful deliberateness she had recently begun to apply to that particular task, as though she had decided that making tea was something worth doing correctly. The hillside was dark. The spring was up there in the dark, moving through the fissure in its quiet way, unchanged by everything that had happened and everything that would happen, consistent with its pressurized source, patient as limestone, persistent as water. She went inside. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.